Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. On December 6, Aung San Suu Kyi was handed down a prison sentence by a court loyal to Myanmar's military junta. Until February this year, Suu Kyi was the de facto civilian leader of Myanmar. Her party, the National League for Democracy, had just won re-election in a landslide victory, the results of which were rejected by the military, which mounted a coup. The military junta were not swayed by massive protests throughout the country and began violently suppressing dissent. Now, violence seems to be escalating, prompting the UN's top human rights official to warn that Myanmar may be sliding into a civil war. My guest today, Matthew Smith, is the co-founder and CEO of Fortify Rights, a human rights organization long active in Myanmar. We kick off discussing the circumstances of Aung San Suu Kyi's criminal conviction before having a broader conversation about the escalating crisis in Myanmar. Our conversation was recorded live on Twitter using the new Twitter Spaces platform. Twitter is partnering with the podcast to produce episodes recorded as Twitter Spaces. If you'd like to participate in one of these live recordings, the best thing to do is follow me on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg. And now here is my conversation with Matthew Smith of Fortify Rights.
This conviction, in many ways, is not surprising. It was rather expected, but it's obviously no less concerning. Along with of course, several thousand other people that remain in prison, along with the detention of Aung San Suu Kyi. It does signal the military junta digging its heels in, entrenching itself, and further escalating the current crisis, unfortunately.
Could we maybe step back and briefly explain to listeners how we got to this point and the circumstances of the February coup?
The proximate situation, or the more recent events that led to the coup on February 1st, relates in some ways directly to the 2020 elections in November 2020, which Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the National League for Democracy, won overwhelmingly. The military's response largely consisted of allegations of voter fraud. Essentially what the military generals, many of whom are international criminals, in our view, many of them got on this bandwagon of essentially arguing that the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi stole the election. Certainly language that American listeners will find familiar. And unfortunately, that culminated on February 1st when the new government was meant to form. In the early morning hours, the military essentially began to carry out this military coup d'etat, initially starting by arresting Aung San Suu Kyi and President Win Myint and several others. And then that effort has sadly only grown since then.
So initially, first of all, there were huge protests when this coup was carried out, overwhelmingly peaceful protests. And what was interesting to me, striking to me, I don't follow Myanmar issues particularly closely. It seemed to be that the protests were widespread, urban, rural, various sectors and segments of society came out to protest this coup. And it was overwhelmingly peaceful. What was the sort of initial junta military response to these protests?
Well, one of the first things that the military did was to block Facebook. They recognized very early on that the people of Myanmar were organizing themselves online in resistance to the coup. And very soon after the coup, actually health workers throughout Myanmar were the first to walk out of their positions in government-run hospitals as a form of protest that grew into what the people of Myanmar refer to as the civil disobedience movement, which now involves a large number, various sectors, huge numbers of people participating in that. As you mentioned, protests were massive. They were nationwide, and the military shortly thereafter tolerated the protests for a period of time, but then essentially went on a killing spree. And so our team was documenting widespread and systematic murders taking place in the streets of Myanmar. And this was happening in the city's larger urban centers, as well as in more remote or rural towns and villages. Soldiers were deploying, the military and police were deploying snipers. They were firing indiscriminately into groups of protesters, men, women, and children killed. So all told, they killed more than 1,200 people since the coup has unfolded. And there are other crimes that have been happening as well. We're documenting widespread imprisonment. Essentially, the military and police are rounding up anybody who is perceived to be critical of the military coup, which, of course, is the vast majority of the country, is obviously opposed to what is happening right now with the military. They're opposed to the coup, but it's become an incredibly dangerous place for all people in Myanmar.
Could you maybe relate or tell the story of, say, an individual who has been detained unlawfully that you've documented as part of your research, as part of your organization's human rights research?
Sure. I mean, we have documented imprisonment as a crime against humanity happening, as mentioned, in urban areas and rural areas. A lot of these cases are very similar in that you'll have young people, for example, took to the streets in huge numbers. Thousands of young people were arrested, in many cases facing torture. The military has been carrying out various modes of torture against people for many, many years. That certainly is not new to Myanmar. There's no rule of law, of course, so people are essentially being sentenced without any sort of there's no fair trial. The judiciary is completely compromised by the military, controlled by the military, and has been all for a very long time. And so what a lot of these people find themselves in is a situation in which they're effectively either disappeared or imprisoned in one of the country's more than 50 prisons throughout.
As the military government meted out violence against dissidents and against those who are supporting the civil disobedience movement, how has the movement itself evolved in the months and in response to this violence by the junta?
Yeah, it's a great question. The movement has evolved in a number of ways. I think it's fair to say that millions upon millions of people have, in one way or another, actively resisted this coup and actively protested this coup, whether that is taking to the streets or in the evenings, banging pots and pans as a tactic of protest against the military, against the coup. A lot of people in Myanmar had expected, reasonably so, that there would be a lot more action from the international community when the military went on its killing spree and began arresting, detaining, torturing, killing men, women, and children in large numbers. And unfortunately, the international community has failed the people of Myanmar once again. And so in response to that failure, a number of people throughout the country have taken up arms and joined what are essentially called the People's Defense Forces, or PDF. So there are PDF units throughout the country in various locations that are now actively engaged in armed conflict. And you have situations of young people who had bright futures futures in front of them, had decent jobs working in Myanmar's urban areas, and now they find themselves learning how to essentially become a soldier. So this is a tragic story unfolding for the people of Myanmar right now, and there certainly is. It would be crucial right now for more international action, which I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that as well, Mark.
I do want to get into sort of international responses, but what you just said is sort of why I wanted to speak with you today. This idea that Myanmar may be sliding into a new iteration of an armed conflict. I noticed with interest UN saying, I think it was Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, warning of the possibility of an outright civil war happening in Myanmar as a result of sort of the military cracking down on this protest movement and the protesters, many of whom are now taking up arms. Like, how widespread is this armed opposition to the military junta right now, as opposed to other elements of the protest movement that are still committed to nonviolence?
Well, I think it's important for people to understand that Myanmar is a country that's been at war for a very long time, for decades. In fact, the armed conflict in Karen State on Myanmar's eastern border, is regarded as one of the world's longest ongoing civil wars. The people of Karen State have been enduring armed conflict in one way or another since 1949, at least, or the 1950s, and so. Whether it's Kachin State, Shan State, Mon State, what have you, there are a number of locations throughout Myanmar where armed conflict has been ongoing for a very long time. And part of that armed conflict has involved mass atrocity crimes by the Myanmar military. So in many ways, the atrocities that we're seeing now all throughout the country have been endured by Myanmar's ethnic nationalities for many, many years. We're talking about villages being burned to the ground, widespread and systematic rape of women and girls used as a weapon of war. We're talking about widespread torture, imprisonment, genocide, of course, in the context of the ethnic Rohingya population in Rakhine State. So this is certainly not a place that has not been experiencing these types of crimes before. I think what's different right now is the fact that the Myanmar military is doing what it has done to ethnic nationalities for many years to all of Myanmar's people now. So the ethnic Burman majority is in some areas experiencing these types of atrocities. Unfortunately, since the coup, they've been experiencing these same atrocities that have been ongoing for some time. So this is the larger context, I think, of civil war. Some of the concerns about Myanmar, quote unquote, sliding into civil war, I think, is more about the fact that this is an armed conflict that could and is getting much, much bigger. But certainly it is not new. Myanmar is not new to civil war.
And I should say that we're speaking just, I think, a few hours after word kind of first came through social media and has been reported by reputable news outlets of an atrocity that occurred in a village in which the military apparently burnt down the village and executed several people and burnt their bodies. And there's some disturbing images that are kind of coming through on social media on that.
That's right. This was an incident in Sagaing region, which again is one of these places that for the most part has not experienced the type of armed conflict over the years that some of the other ethnic states have, and this particular crime believed to have the military is believed to have burned the bodies of at least 11 people, including reportedly a child. This is sadly consistent with Myanmar military behavior in situations like this. They have, back in 2016, 2017, we were documenting how the military had razed to the ground more than 300 villages just in northern Rakhine State, ethnic Rohingya villages. And as part of that onslaught. As part of that genocidal attack, an enormous number of men, women, and children were burned in similar fashion as occurred in Sagaing region recently. And so this is part of the Myanmar military's dreadful and barbaric approach to this political situation unfolding.
So with Aung San Suu Kyi sidelined, deposed in a coup, placed under arrest, and now convicted, you've seen the sort of rise to prominence of this new national unity government, which seems to be almost like this kind of shadow government that is the umbrella group of opposition forces that are both in political and also apparently in armed opposition to the military junta. Can you just sort of describe what is this group? How did it arise? And sort of what legitimacy does it have right now?
Yeah, the National Unity Government arose out of something called the CRPH, Committee Representing the Pidong Sulata. And it's essentially elected officials, elected parliamentarians and others formed this group soon after the coup, and then eventually established the National Unity Government some months ago. And it is often referred to as a parallel government. And from our perspective, it's not the most accurate way to refer to the National Unity Government. We don't see it as a parallel government because that would imply that the Myanmar junta is the other government that it is parallel to. And the junta, of course, is not a government. This is a criminal gang, as UN Special Rapporteur Tom Andrews referred to them just the other day. It's a terrorist criminal enterprise that is exerting brutal power over 54 million people throughout the country. But yes, the National Unity Government does comprise elected officials and some others who have since been appointed. It is the closest thing Myanmar has to a democratically elected government under this current situation. There are a number of National Unity Government cabinet level people are still in the country conducting the business of government, the business of this revolution from positions of hiding in many cases. And this is the fight of their life in many cases. And the military is going to great lengths to try to quash the National Unity Government, which is, of course, an indicator in our view of ultimately of the Myanmar military's weakness. The only thing that the military has is weapons. They don't have the hearts and minds of the people. And so the only way they can maintain power is by doing what they're doing, which is, of course, in violation of any number of international laws and effectively constitutes mass atrocity crimes.
So with Aung San Suu Kyi, effectively, imprisoned potentially for as long as this junta is in control, which could be, the rest of her life. She's 76 years old. She's facing a short prison sentence for these particular spurious crimes, but they could pile on other criminal convictions on top of her that could keep her in prison for forever, potentially. What can or what is, first of all, the international community doing, if anything, to support this opposition National Unity Government right now? And what more can the international community be doing to support the opposition in Myanmar?
Well, there are a number of governments. The National Unity Government is engaging with governments around the world, and we do know that a number of governments are electing to not engage the Myanmar junta, which is the correct course of action. No government should lend even a shred of political legitimacy to the military junta.
And I should just say that the United Nations has sort of rejected the application for credentials of the junta's representatives at the UN. Just recently, this happened just this week.
That's right. They deferred the Credentials Committee. Thankfully, deferred the decision, and so National Unity Government Ambassador John Motoon will retain his credentials at the UN, which is can't be underestimated. The importance of that, but certainly. governments have been engaging with the National Unity Government, and we are encouraging governments to get behind the National Unity Government's efforts to achieve justice and accountability. This is one particular area, particular part of this situation that we feel is very important, largely because it is the widespread impunity that the Myanmar military has enjoyed for many years, for decades, in fact, that we believe has ultimately led to this situation. So it is critically important right now that governments band together to isolate the junta. We have seen sanctions. We've seen some targeted sanctions imposed by a number of governments, including the US government, the UK, and others. There's still a lot to do. There's a lot more that governments around the world can do. Right now, the UN Security Council, for example, has, perhaps it's unsurprising, the UN Security Council has failed to discharge its mandate to protect international peace and security, and has failed to impose any sort of, take any action whatsoever. We've seen some statements, but that's about it. And so, for example, one thing that the Security Council could do would be to impose a global arms embargo against the Myanmar military. And part of the strategy here is really to deny the Myanmar military access to the things that it craves, and the things that it craves are weapons, finances, and access to the international financial institutions, or international financial system, rather, and political legitimacy. And so if there is one thing that governments around the world can and should be doing, it would be denying the Myanmar military those three things.
So this runs into the challenge at the Security Council, which is that the Chinese government, while not necessarily like a close ally of the junta, nonetheless is not seeking to impose any sanctions or take any meaningful action. So it's really the holdup at the Security Council is the threat of the Chinese veto, and that has so far prevented the Security Council from taking any meaningful action along the lines of what you just described. So, I mean, given that geopolitical reality, like, what are other options or alternatives available to the international community to apply pressure or to threaten the military junta in one way or other with some sort of like justice and accountability for the crimes they're committing?
Well, from our perspective, there are some indicators that Beijing is not happy with the Tatmadaw. They're not. They're
and I should say that the Tatmadaw, for those who don't know, is the formal name of the military of Myanmar.
Yes, of course. Thank you for that. Yeah, there are some indicators that Beijing is reportedly unhappy with the military's with the situation that the military has carried out. It's worth noting that what we believe they're unhappy about is essentially what would be referred to or conceptualized as instability. So that in some ways is the bar for the government of China. We've seen China turn a blind eye to genocide in Myanmar, war crimes, crimes against humanity for quite some time. Those types of crimes are typically not what the government has demonstrated any concern about. So there is this shameful dynamic taking place where you have China and Russia effectively propping up this regime, turning a blind eye to mass atrocity crimes, preventing the Security Council from taking meaningful action. That said, a resolution that would mandate a global arms embargo against the Myanmar military has not been put forward. And so we are encouraging the UK government as a Security Council member that, quote unquote, holds the pen on Myanmar, meaning that the UK government takes responsibility to advance any discussions or potential action with regard to Myanmar at the Security Council. We are encouraging the government to put forward a resolution to push this issue forward. It's long overdue. And beyond that, there is a lot that other governments can be doing. The US government, for example, could initiate targeted sanctions that would effectively prevent the Myanmar military from stealing the natural gas revenues. These are the people's natural resources, and right now the military junta is receiving enormous payments from multinational oil and gas companies, including one project that Chevron, U.S. company, is involved in. And so governments can interdict that revenue, prevent those payments from getting to the junta, hold that money in escrow until a democratic government is established in Myanmar, in which case we would expect the relevant authorities to free those funds up.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of quoted Tom Andrews, the UN Special Rapporteur on Myanmar, as describing the junta as like a criminal gang. And it seems that they fund their criminal enterprise in part through export of natural gas. And you're saying that like individual or sectorial sanctions imposed by the U.S. Treasury Department could prevent the export of that gas and sort of hold that money in escrow.
That's right. And, my understanding is there are several various methods that could be employed to achieve that end through sanctions, through coordinating with other governments. And it's worth mentioning as well that, the oil and gas industry in Myanmar has been complicit in human rights violations like forced labor, torture, killings. For example, the Yadana natural gas pipeline, which is of Total, a French company, Chevron, which was formerly Unical, and a state-owned Thai firm. The construction of this natural gas pipeline occurred in the 1990s, early 1990s, precisely at a time when the Myanmar military was broke. And so back then, it was natural gas revenues that propped up the military junta and kept the country on a very destructive course that it is still on. And so once again, we're seeing a situation in which a military junta in Myanmar is relying on those same gas sales to prop itself up. So it's a longstanding problem, and it is something that deserves urgent attention.
Matthew, I have one last question for you. Before I ask you that question, I do want to encourage anyone who's listening right now to raise their hand, request to speak. If they have a question, we can maybe get through a few questions if you'd like. My last question to you, though, going forward, what will you be looking towards in the next, coming days or weeks or months that will suggest to you how this crisis is unfolding? Are there any sort of key inflection points in the coming, days or weeks or months that you are looking towards?
Well, we at Fortify Rights, we have been collecting and documenting the Myanmar military's crimes. We are investigating the specific individuals that we believe are responsible for this coup crackdown, and we are preparing to release more information about things like the military's command responsibility, essentially information that we believe would be important for prosecutors that are working to hold the Myanmar, hold perpetrators of the Myanmar military accountable. And so at Fortify Rights, at least, and with some of our colleagues and partners, that will be an important moment, we hope, that will help inform some of these accountability mechanisms that are in motion slowly, but are in motion globally. But beyond that, there are indicators that the situation, particularly in some of Myanmar's ethnic areas, could worsen considerably. The military has been moving troops to various places. We're seeing increased armed conflict, increased mass atrocity crimes in places like Chin State, Sagaing region, and elsewhere. And there is a concern that's taking place. Another thing to mention is the denial of humanitarian aid. This is an area where, in some of the ethnic states in particular, the Myanmar military is forcibly displacing civilians, but then preventing aid workers from accessing those civilians, which is, of course, a war crime. And so we are encouraging governments to engage in cross-border aid. The aid is not going to be able to reach those who need it most from the center of Myanmar because of the military junta's repression. And so the answer there is, of course, to bring aid across Myanmar's borders most. Not necessarily inflection points, but these are some of the ongoing, in some cases, impossibly difficult scenarios that the people of Myanmar are finding themselves in. So I would encourage listeners to, educate themselves on these issues, and if they do feel so compelled, the people of Myanmar can certainly use their support.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Mark. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Matthew Smith for speaking with me in this unique platform, Twitter Spaces. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg if you'd like to be alerted when I'm scheduling one of these. And I often leave room for audience participation at the end of each interview. Otherwise, no need. You can just keep on listening as you keep listening, and I'll keep serving you up 2 episodes a week every week. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.